For over 50 years, the topic of the American moon landings in the 1960s has remained a thorny, highly debated issue. On one side, you have a group of people who firmly believe the Americans actually went up there. On the other side, you have people who believe it was the greatest hoax in modern history. And the question that naturally comes up is, why is this debate still going on? I mean, why are we still arguing about this more than half a century later? Why isn't there a definitive piece of evidence to prove, once and for all, whether they went or not, so we can finally lock this case and throw away the key? Welcome to Curious at Midnight. Before we dive in, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification so you never miss our future videos. The iconic scene of American astronaut Neil Armstrong stepping onto the lunar surface and saying, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," was the ultimate declaration of America's victory in the space race against the Soviet Union. But as time went on, and the initial excitement faded, people started asking questions. And over time, those questions morphed into full-blown conspiracy theories. Skeptics started asking, how could primitive 1960s technology possibly send astronauts to the moon and bring them safely back to Earth? When they looked closely at the videos and photos released by NASA, they found little details that just didn't add up. Things like the American flag waving when there is no air on the moon, or the complete absence of stars in the sky, or lighting that looked more like studio spotlights than natural sunlight. But on the flip side, NASA and astronomers had their counter-arguments ready. They pointed to the lunar rocks brought back to Earth, and the equipment that is still sitting on the surface of the moon today. Yet, neither side has fully convinced the other. Today, I'm not here to tell you right off the bat whether they went or not. Instead, I'm going to break down these conspiracy theories piece by piece, look at the counter-arguments, and keep things as objective as possible. We are going to try and figure out, did humanity actually step on the moon, or was it the biggest deception of the 20th century? To understand this story from the very beginning, we need to travel back in time to 1957, when the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite in history. First of all, we need to understand that the space race wasn't really about serving humanity, or a passion for scientific discovery. It was purely a battle for power and dominance. It was about who could develop intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles, and who would dictate the future. In the beginning, the Soviets were dominating the race completely, from Laika the space dog, to Yuri Gagarin. America was left looking incredibly embarrassed on the global stage. That's why President John F. Kennedy played his final card, took a massive gamble, and declared, "We are going to the moon." He basically said, if they raise the stakes, we'll raise them higher. Under this immense pressure, astronomical budgets were poured into the Apollo program and its predecessors. Adjusted for today's inflation, we are talking about more than $300 billion. And here is a very important point we need to pause at. Did America use all this hype to set an economic trap for the Soviets? The theory goes that if the Americans faked the landing in a studio, they killed two birds with one stone. They won the media war, and they forced the Soviets to bleed their real resources and billions of rubles in a fake space race, trying to catch up to an America that had supposedly beaten them. Especially when you realize that the space race was one of the actual reasons that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They spent staggering amounts of money in a desperate attempt to catch up to the Americans, who had suddenly and inexplicably leaped ahead of them. So, the idea that America might have pulled off a massive hustle isn't entirely far-fetched. Especially since, here in 2026, we know that the US government has been caught in dozens of lies and cover-ups over the last 70 years, things that were once taken as absolute facts. So, we have every right to ask, and ask loudly, was what we saw a genuine engineering triumph, or was it just a strategic illusion? To get a clear answer to this, we need to divide the arguments into three parts. First up, we have the original telemetry tapes. In 2006, NASA admitted that they had lost around 700 boxes containing the original data tapes of the Apollo 11 mission, which included the high-quality recordings of Armstrong's first steps. The official excuse? The tapes were erased and reused to record other satellite data, to save money. Think about that. A space agency spending billions of dollars on a national project couldn't afford to buy new blank tapes, so they taped over the most important recording in human history? Naturally, this sounds completely absurd. Skeptics argue that if those tapes actually existed, today's modern technology could easily scan them for errors and expose the whole fake operation. Which is exactly why they claim, NASA conveniently lost them. Another strange anomaly is the famous C rock. In one of the photos from the Apollo 16 mission, there's a rock sitting on the ground with a perfect letter, C, printed clearly on it. It looks exactly like a stage prop on a movie set. I mean, who goes around writing the letter C on a moon rock? NASA's response to this was pretty bizarre. They claimed it wasn't a letter at all. They said a stray hair got stuck during the scanning process of the photo negatives, and by pure coincidence, it looked like a C. But when independent researchers went back to the original negative, cleaned it, and rescanned it, the negative was completely clean. There was no C and no hair. Unsurprisingly, this excuse didn't convince a lot of people. The third thing is the highly suspicious press conference right after the Apollo 11 crew returned. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were sitting there looking like they were at a funeral. Their eyes were darting at the floor, they looked incredibly tense, and seemed like they were carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. When a reporter asked them if they saw any stars while on the moon, they started stuttering. They used weird, evasive language like, "Not that I can recall," or "I don't remember." They acted as if they were terrified of messing up a rehearsed script. This specific interview left a major impact on how people viewed the mission. The first and biggest question is the manual docking. The tiny lunar module that launched from the surface of the moon had to dock perfectly with the command module. Keep in mind, this command module was orbiting the moon at 3,500 miles per hour. To picture this, imagine someone holding a gun and shooting a bullet to perfectly hit another moving bullet, in mid-air, in pitch-black darkness. How could they calculate that rendezvous trajectory with such extreme precision using 1969 technology? Especially when we know the Apollo guidance computer had less processing power than a cheap smartwatch you'd buy off the street today. Add to that, just last year, despite all our insane technological advancements, we saw two astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, stuck on the International Space Station for over 280 days because of a helium leak in their spacecraft. NASA's response to this is, yes, the computers back then were weak, but they were perfectly designed to do one specific job. Also, the heavy, complex calculations were actually being done by massive servers down here on Earth. Most importantly, the final control was in the hands of elite, highly trained test pilots, not amateurs. This exact docking procedure had been practiced over and over again during the Gemini missions, years before Apollo. Neil Armstrong himself proved his incredible skill during the Gemini 8 mission in 1966, when he manually docked with an Agena target vehicle, and managed to save his spinning spacecraft from total disaster with enviable composure. That exact moment is why he was chosen to command Apollo 11. The success didn't just happen overnight. It was built on years of trial and error. From the Mercury program 1958 to 1963, which put Americans into Earth orbit, to the Gemini program 1962 to 1966, where they mastered spacewalks and orbital rendezvous. And not all of these tests were successful. On January 27, 1967, during the Apollo 1 test, a fire broke out in the capsule, tragically killing astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. That disaster forced NASA to completely redesign their spacecraft. Another thing that catches people's attention in the Apollo photos is the sky. It is pitch black. Not a single star is visible. Logic tells us that if you are in space, standing on the moon with no atmosphere and no clouds, you should see millions of stars, right? So, did NASA forget to paint the stars on the studio backdrop and just decided to leave it black? NASA's response is simple. The photos were taken during the lunar morning. How can you see stars in broad daylight? You might ask, how is it morning if the sky is black? Well, because the moon has no atmosphere to scatter the sunlight and turn the sky blue like here on Earth. The sky remains black even when the sun is shining brightly. The difference is, the stars are washed out by the intense glare of the sun. To properly photograph the brightly lit astronauts and the glaring white lunar surface, the cameras needed a very fast shutter speed and low light sensitivity. If they had left the shutter open long enough to capture the faint light of the stars, the astronauts would have just looked like glowing, washed out white blobs in the photos. Now we get to the granddaddy of all skeptic evidence. The waving American flag. The video clearly shows the flag rippling, as if a gentle breeze is blowing. But we know the moon has no atmosphere, which means no wind. So the flag shouldn't move, unless, of course, they were filming on Earth and someone accidentally left a studio fan running. NASA explained that their engineers knew a regular cloth flag would just hang down limply like a wet towel in a vacuum. So, they designed a special flagpole with a horizontal L-shaped crossbar at the top to hold the fabric out flat. However, the astronauts couldn't fully extend this horizontal rod, which created those permanent ripples and wrinkles in the fabric. As for the movement itself, that's just basic physics. Inertia. When the astronaut twisted and pushed the pole into the hard lunar dirt, that rotational vibration traveled up the pole and into the fabric. And because there is no air resistance on the moon to slow the fabric down, it just kept waving and oscillating for a long time until the energy finally dissipated. Not because there was wind, but because there was nothing to stop it. If you watch the footage closely, once the astronaut steps back, the flag eventually stops moving entirely, even though the wrinkles remain. Also, here is a fun paradox. The people using the "no air" argument to debunk the moon landing are using science given to us by the very same agencies they are doubting. Another major talking point is the shadows. According to physics, if the sun is the only light source on the moon, all shadows should run parallel and point in the exact same direction, right? But if you look at the Apollo photos, the shadows are all over the place. Some point left, some point right. It looks exactly like there were multiple studio lights pointing at the set. Photography experts, however, point out that this has nothing to do with studio lights. It is entirely about perspective. If you stand in the middle of a long, straight road, or on a set of railroad tracks, and look off into the distance, the parallel lines appear to converge and meet at the horizon. This is a basic rule of perspective that any first-year art or geometry student knows. That is exactly what is happening in a 2D photograph taken on the moon. Furthermore, the idea of multiple studio lights is physically ridiculous. Because of the inverse square law of light, any artificial light source, no matter how powerful, drops off drastically the further you get from it. If you hold a bright spotlight in the middle of a football field, the ground near you is bright, but it quickly fades to black. But in the moon photos, the ground is illuminated evenly for miles. Mountains way off in the background are lit up exactly the same as the rocks at the astronauts' feet. Only a massive, distant light source, like the sun, can do that. In fact, in 2014, the graphics card company Nvidia created a digital simulation tracking the path of every single photon of light on the lunar surface, and their results perfectly matched NASA's original photos. Next up is point number 5, the Van Allen radiation belts. Planet Earth is surrounded by intense zones of trapped, highly charged radioactive particles. Anyone leaving Earth to go to the moon absolutely has to fly right through them. The question is, how did a capsule made of thin aluminum and primitive 60s spacesuits protect human beings from this lethal radiation? Skeptics insist they should have died, or at least returned with severe cancer. So how did they come back perfectly healthy? NASA explained that the Apollo spacecraft passed through the Van Allen belts at extreme speeds, minimizing their exposure time. The flight trajectory was meticulously calculated to bypass the most intense radiation zones and slice through the thinnest, safest areas. In the end, the total radiation dose the astronauts received was roughly equivalent to getting a standard chest X-ray at the hospital. The ironic part here is that NASA, and Dr. James Van Allen himself, were the ones who actually discovered these belts using the Explorer 1 and 3 satellites, and mapped them out. So, why do we trust NASA when they say the deadly belts exist, but call them liars when they explain how they navigated through them? The sixth argument NASA had to answer is, how did you leave Earth using a massive Saturn V rocket, the size of a skyscraper, with a gigantic launch pad and thousands of ground support crew, but somehow managed to blast off from the moon in a module the size of a tin can, with no launch pad at all? Because this topic is highly technical and has a ton of fascinating engineering details, we decided to give it its own dedicated video. That one will drop in a few days. Finally, we arrive at the third part, the rock-solid evidence presented by NASA that is extremely difficult to deny. Amidst all the noise and skepticism, NASA holds several trump cards that back up their official story. Unfortunately, skeptics tend to completely ignore this evidence, which honestly makes their arguments look a bit weak. The first, and arguably the strongest card in the deck, is the Soviet Union itself. Remember, this was the peak of the Cold War. The Russians were tracking every single radio telemetry signal coming from the Apollo spacecraft with their own radar systems. If they had detected that the signal was bouncing off a relay station on Earth instead of coming from the moon, they would have exposed America to the entire world. Their absolute silence, and their official recognition of the landing, is the greatest proof that it happened. Furthermore, the conspiracy is a logistical nightmare. The Apollo project employed 400,000 people, engineers, technicians, and factory workers. How do you guarantee the absolute silence of an army that size for 50 years? Statistically speaking, the idea that not a single person had a guilty conscience, or sold the secret to the press for millions, is just naive. The second piece of evidence is the ultimate prize, 842 pounds, 382 kilograms, of moon rocks. When NASA brought these rocks back, they didn't just lock them in a vault and say, "Just trust us." They distributed samples to laboratories and universities in over 135 countries around the world. And yes, Soviet scientists received samples too. Independent chemical and geological analysis confirmed that these rocks are fundamentally different from anything found on Earth. The Soviet Academy of Sciences tested them and publicly verified their authenticity. If the Soviets had even a shred of doubt that these rocks were fake, it would have been game over for the US. The third piece of evidence comes from the modern era. In 2009, NASA launched the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, to map the moon in high resolution. The probe flew low over the Apollo landing sites, and the photographs clearly show the descent stages, the rovers, and the equipment left behind on the surface. And before you say, well, of course NASA would fake those pictures too, keep in mind that America isn't the only country taking pictures. Lunar orbiters from India, China, and Japan have independently photographed the exact same sites and confirmed the exact same artifacts. At the end of this long journey, when we tie all the threads together, we see that there are indeed valid questions and weird anomalies surrounding the mission. But at the same time, the sheer volume of physical and technological evidence makes it incredibly hard to believe the whole thing was just a stage play. It is entirely possible that the Americans really did go to the moon, but some of the photos and videos we saw were enhanced, retouched, or even partially recreated on Earth for propaganda purposes, just to make sure everything looked absolutely perfect for the public. That scenario is far more likely than the entire mission being a giant hoax. There might be a little bit of deception involved, but to what extent? That is the part that remains unsolved to this day. Don't forget to check back in a few days for our follow-up video on the lunar launch. And that's a wrap. Who made it this far? If you're still watching, you guys are the real MVPs. Drop a like before you head out so we know how many of you stuck around to the end. And if you have a random late-night question keeping you awake, drop it in the comments below so we can cover it in a future video. Peace.